Good morning, everyone. This is the Air Modeling for Non-Modelers What's Up with the New Ambient Standards webinar. And I'm James Westbrook, and I'm the president of Bluescape. Thank you very much for attending today. Well, EPA has recently adopted new 1-hour ambient health standards for NO2 and SO2. And now greater consideration is required for compliance with fine particulate or PM2.5 standards. With new tighter standards, it's more important than ever to understand how modeling requirements can impact your projects. My goal today is to get you thinking about potential modeling issues for your projects so you can avoid getting tangled. I will give you some ways to plan to stay out of or get out of modeling problems. Before I begin, I would like to start a poll to see where people are in modeling projects. The question is air quality modeling something your company is managing or doing right now? Please select one. Yes, we have a consulting doing modeling now. Yes, we are modeling in-house for our company or client. No, but modeling is in our near future. Or no, I'm just here to learn about modeling. We'll give just a few seconds for people to respond to this poll and see where we are. If everyone can please select an option. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the results. All right, it looks like most of the people here, about 34%, are here to learn about modeling and what may happen with their projects. We do have about 27% that have a consultant doing modeling now, or we have possibly some consultants or in-house companies doing modeling. And about 14% have modeling in the near future. Well, for today, I'm going to be talking about the new ambient standards. First, I'll be discussing compliance with the ambient standards and how dispersion modeling is used. I will be talking about the new ambient standards, and I will be looking at strategies to pass the standards, things you can consider with challenges you may be facing. There are some that are maybe quick refinement techniques that can be done easily, and then there are more advanced techniques. I will be showing an example with the modeling software for a 1-hour NO2 standard case, and I will wrap up with some conclusions. For this presentation, I'm assuming you're not in the business of air quality modeling. You're a facility environmental manager or project developer, or maybe you're an attorney or environmental consultant. I do encourage you to use the webinar panel to send in questions. I will address questions confidentially as I have time, or I will follow up with you after the webinar. Hey, first on Bluescape, we have 20 years experience since the 80s. We've been doing quite a bit of modeling work all over the country. We do have experience with AirMod, CalPuff, and other models used in select situations. What we excel in is tough air quality modeling issues. First of all, getting out of modeling requirements whenever possible, developing meteorological data and monitoring data inputs to the models, which can be very difficult given the complexity of the models. Coming up with refinement strategies for problem impacts, with the goal being to pass standards, go forward in projects. We do a lot of work in that area. And we also do a lot of work looking at the agency protocols and negotiating with agencies to come up with successful strategies. Well, what is air quality modeling used for? Many of you are aware that air quality modeling can be used to show compliance with criteria pollutant ambient standards for facility emissions that are moving off-site, for the process of getting permits under minor source, new source review, or major source PSD or prevention of significant deterioration. Here in California, environmental impact reports often require some type of modeling for impacts. And also they may be used in human health and ecological risk assessments. Basically, the human health standards for air toxics can also be very stringent and can drive the requirement to do modeling. Modeling may also be used for accidental chemical spill releases, long-range visibility impacts, such in the case of using CalPuff, in lawsuits, toxic tort litigation. And AirMod is the model that is now the current regulatory workhorse. This is the model that most agencies in EPA are choosing. So it's very important to be familiar with the use of AirMod for air quality modeling. In a typical air modeling study, you need a project. You need something changing that's going to happen. For example, it might be a new boiler, a new engine that's being installed. Or it could be a new freeway where diesel trucks are going back and forth. Typically, modeling is triggered by exceeding emission significance levels. In the case of PSD, for an existing facility, the threshold might be 40 tons of NOx. If you exceed that, then you have to go into modeling. Once you're into the modeling requirements, there are significant impact levels in a lot of cases. These are thresholds where you only have to look at the project and not everything else that might cause an impact in the ambient air. But if you exceed those levels, you may have to look at the full standard, including background data. In these modeling studies, typically hourly meteorological data and terrain data is used as inputs. And if full impact modeling is required to meet standards, it can be very complicated. It can require the project impacts, plus other facility sources at the same facility, plus nearby facilities outside your facility, and then monitor background concentrations from the area. This is typically the case in a full impact study for PSD, or it may be in something like an EIR, Environmental Impact Report, where you're adding the impact from the modeling to the background. So this can be very complicated. So one goal here is just to avoid exceeding significant emissions in the first place, or staying under the sills. So you don't have to do all the background and all the other things involved here. But I think what you'll find is that for some of these standards, some of the new standards, it can be very difficult to avoid exceeding significance levels or model impact significance levels. Here is a list of the primary National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. This is a partial list. And some of these things on here, like PM10, PM2.5, NO2, SO2, the short-term standards are the ones that are typically the hardest to pass. The ones in red are the newest standards. You can see that the SO2 24-hour has been revoked. There's also an annual NO2 standard. And these are the equivalent values in microgram per meter cubed. They're often listed in ppm or ppb. There's a really great list of standards you can look at on the California Air Resources Board website, and I put the link down here below. Let's talk about the new ambient standards. Just recently, EPA adopted two new standards, NO2 and SO2, and also implemented a policy where now PM2.5 must be considered. This has been something around since 2007, but PM10 had been used as a surrogate for PM2.5, excuse me. In the case of the new NO2 standard, it's a 1 hour average, 100 ppb, or equivalent of 188 microgram per meter cubed. For SO2, it's a 1 hour average, 75 ppb, or 196 microgram per meter cubed. And the PM2.5 standard is a 24-hour average of 35 micrograms per meter cubed. Now, it's really important to understand the form of the standard. It can be really confusing and a bit of a mouthful. So here I go. Let's try this. For the NO2 standard, it is attained when the 3-year average of the 98th percentile of the annual distribution of daily maximum 1 hour concentrations does not exceed 100 ppb. Phew. Similar for the SO2 standard, except it's the 99th percentile. In the case of PM2.5, it's the 98th percentile of 24-hour average values. If you have questions about this, let me know. But basically on the NO2, just to give you an idea of what that means, what you would do is you would look at the highest 1 hour value on every single day for a year for 365 days. So you'd have 365 maximum 1 hour values for each day. And then you would take the high 8th high. That corresponds to the 98th percentile across that year, the high 8th high. And if you have 3 years of meteorological data, or if you have 5 years of meteorological data, you would average that across all of those years. The effect of that is we're not necessarily taking the highest number. We're taking a lower percentile and an average. So while the standard is more stringent, there is a little bit of flexibility in that standard. But it's really important to understand how to use a model to get these numbers. I did want to mention with PM10, in the interim, a facility can justify continuing to use PM10 as a surrogate for PM2.5 or model PM2.5 directly. This policy will be changing next year to where this is no longer allowed. However, it can be as much work to try and justify using PM10 as a surrogate as to just go ahead and model PM2.5. Well, EPA, when they passed these standards, they had some unfinished business. They've been in a bit of a hurry to get the standards out. They have done some memos on modeling. But what's left to do are some of the things like significant impact levels. They haven't been promulgated. PSD increments, and even monitoring concentration thresholds that set where you require monitoring. EPA says they're going to be coming out with more guidance on this, more promulgation of rules, but they haven't happened yet. In the meantime, what states are doing is they're coming up with their own values to be used, because the states are being told, you have to do modeling, you have to have applicants send in this modeling before they can get their permits. So the states are going forward and setting what their thresholds are. Also, there's a question about background monitoring data. Is there enough data? Where would you get the data? In the case of nearby facility emissions data for PM2.5, it can be difficult to get this data, so there's a lot of uncertainty around data availability. Also, EPA has recognized that secondary PM can be formed, such as in the case when you have ammonia in a stack, and that ammonia can convert to secondary PM formation after the stack. This has not yet been addressed in how modeling would be done for secondary PM2.5 and how that would be added to background concentrations. There's also a need to formally pass a standard for source testing for condensable emissions, emissions of PM in the back half, which is often the case for some facilities. That's where most of the emissions lie. So there are new air modeling challenges as a result of these new standards. With combustion sources, these sources tend to have relatively high NO2 emissions, a lot of them being existing sources. So relative to the standards, the emissions are high, especially given the 1-hour standard. In the case of PM10, a lot of facilities have been assuming PM10 from combustion equals PM2.5. Well, now we have a much lower standard, 35 microgram per meter cubed versus 150. The 98th percentile does give some relief in terms of meeting the standard, but you still have a standard 4 times lower than PM10. This can cause a lot of problems for combustion sources. It's a much more stringent level to meet. With a lot of these NO2 sources, they're going to be engines or motor vehicles, diesel trucks. They're close to the ground, and as a result, this means higher impacts. So in a lot of cases, it will be very difficult for these sources to pass the standards, and it's going to mean taking a very close look at those emissions and figuring out a way to make them pass the standard or coming up with mitigation to lower them to the extent feasible, as in the case of an environmental impact report. In the case of PSD modeling in significance levels, the significance levels can be very low. For NO2, 7.5 microgram per meter cubed is the recommendation by EPA. It's very unlikely that a lot of sources being installed, such as engines, boilers, and so forth, will be able to meet that significance level. What that will do is throw facilities into full impact modeling in a lot of cases, unless the project can be designed to avoid that modeling. So what do you do if you're looking at a project in the next 1 to 2 years with all these challenges facing you? Well, my recommendation is to do due diligence modeling. You know you have some projects coming up. You know what they potentially could be. You should start running your modeling now to figure out what the problems are going to be. You should come up with a strategic design process once you understand what the problems are. Get ahead of the curve in terms of figuring out what that's going to be. And you should also stay close on EPA and state agency developments, because every single state is going to be looking at these issues and coming up with different ways to handle these issues. Before I continue, I'd like to launch another poll to see how you're feeling about all this. The question is, if you are currently or soon will have a project requiring modeling, what is your expectation? The modeling will pass the standards with flying colors. We will have to work to make it pass, but we'll get there. It could get really ugly, or I have no idea. We'll give people a few seconds here to see how you're feeling about these standards and where you are going with your modeling project. Okay, now I'm going to close the poll, share the results. Okay, nobody expects the modeling to pass with flying colors. I guess I scared you just sufficiently to make that one go away. We have 37% that say they'll have to work to make it pass. It could get really ugly, which is a third of the people. That's a very big number, and the rest have no idea. And I think this is probably where you're going to be. I think you need to go into every study looking at PM10, PM2.5, and NO2 with a lot of awareness of what could happen. Next, I'm going to talk about some strategies. That you can use to pass the modeling. The first set of strategies I'm going to call quick fix. These are things that you can do as you're designing your project, as you're doing some modeling iterations, due diligence, to try and pass the standards. These are typically going to be project design changes. Things like emission limitations. You can limit the fuel throughput or material throughput in some cases, or limit the hours of operation. This is the case where you don't need all 8760 hours. You don't need the full potential of the source to emit. You can apply limitations. And that's just in putting restrictions and permits. You can limit the hourly engine testing. A lot of times the impacts that the agencies are concerned about are the regular engine testing impacts. If you have multiple engines and they're all being tested at the same time, obviously your maximum hourly emissions will be a lot higher. You can look at engine phasing and conditions around testing that will lower the maximum hourly emissions. In some cases, it might be necessary to install voluntary control technology installation. It may have to go beyond best available control technology for NOx emissions, or SO2, in order to pass the standards. This is a fairly easy thing to design in, but can be very expensive. Stack height increases, physical changes to stack heights, are very, very useful, very good for low-level stacks. If you double a stack height, something at 10 feet, 15 feet, you can get a very large reduction in impact. EPA does allow stack increases up to 65 meters, so this can be a very good way to make impacts go away or be reduced. You can also increase gas flow rate and temperature, push more air through the stack, make the plume go higher, raise the temperature to make the plume go higher from buoyancy. Typically not as effective as raising stack height, but something you can consider doing. Well, if those things don't pass, there are advanced strategies that you can use to pass the standards. For NO2, NO2 impacts in the environment. When NO2 is being formed, it's being formed in the stack first as NO. There's a little bit of NO2 formed in the stack. Once that NO goes into the atmosphere, it converts in the presence of ozone to NO2. There are some different strategies listed in the EPA memo of using different tools. PVMRM is the plume volume molar ratio method. OLM is the ozone limiting method. And ARM is an ambient ratio method. PVMRM and OLM are typically used for the short-term impacts, ARM for the annual impacts. And these are techniques that can be used to essentially reduce the NO2 impact because there's not enough ozone to convert that NO to NO2. I'm not going to spend time here talking about the details of these approaches, but you can discuss this more with me offline. In the case of the in-stack ratio, that is the ratio of NO2 to NOx, total NOx emissions formed in the stack, the typical default has been 10%, but lately EPA has been recommending that states look at 20 to 30%. So it may become important to look at that in-stack conversion because that part of the NO2 emissions you have to assume right away as part of your impact. You may want to do a source test to find out what that ratio is in some cases. In the case of particulate matter, where you can reduce the PM10 for the PM2.5 fraction, reduce your PM2.5 emissions essentially, that can be a good way to reduce impacts. That's useful in the case of fugitive dust studies and also for cooling tower emissions. You can also look at the meteorological data. Sometimes 1 hour impacts have to do with interesting effects in the meteorological data. Very conservative low wind speed conditions, surface roughness conditions that don't make a whole lot of sense. So the meteorological data in some cases can be adjusted within reason to account for very high impacts. If these techniques don't work, there is what's called spatial and temporal modeling. Spatial and temporal modeling means looking at the impacts, the combination of impacts with the facility, the project, nearby sources, and background in space and time at the same space and time. The goal of doing this is to show that the project does not cause or contribute to significant impacts for a given 1 hour period or 24-hour period. What often happens is that the impacts of the background, the nearby facilities, and the project all happen at different times, and they're all added together very conservatively. This is very complicated, detailed modeling. It requires a lot of really good data, but this is the way that I have shown in the past that a project passes standards. It's very difficult to do. In the case of some impacts, very high impacts, you can also take a look at the periods that contribute to high values and only look at meteorological conditions for those high periods. Again, takes a lot of analysis, a lot of wind data analysis and modeling to come up with the appropriate approach. If you really think you have very high impacts and you want to prove it to the agency, one thing you could do is put a monitor right where you think the point of maximum impact is going to be. Put an NO2 monitor, SO2 monitor, etc. Obviously, this takes a lot more expense and time to do, but it is a technique that could be used or maybe even required by the agency to show that the impacts are not as high as the model shows because the models tend to be very conservative. Agency negotiation. This is not the time to be sending in modeling studies without protocols, without talking to the agency. A lot of the things I've talked about have to be approved by the agency before you do them. They're also working on these issues. They will work with you to figure out an approach. You need to come in with a plan, but it's important to talk to the agency upfront and often throughout the process of trying to get a permit, trying to go through EIR, et cetera. I highly recommend going through agency negotiation. All right, now I'm going to give you a modeling example. We're actually going to do some modeling to show you how this works. This is a large gas-fired boiler and emergency diesel engine. For the baseline, we'll assume that all NOx emissions, NO and NO2 included, equals NO2. And we'll look at the high and maximum 1-hour modeling impacts plus the background. Just to make it easy, we're going to assume the background's 88 micrograms per meter cubed. If that doesn't pass, we'll consider some refinements. We'll look at the high 8th high, the daily maximum 1-hour values, like I mentioned before. We will try using the PV-MRM with hourly ozone data. And we'll be using the state-required in-stack NO2 NOx default of 0.2 to start with. If that doesn't work, we can also do a source test for in-stack NO2 NOx ratio and see what we get. And if we have to, we can increase our stack height for sources where needed and reduce emissions. This shows you a physical representation of this scenario. What I have here are a boiler stack and an engine stack. And you can see they're located on buildings. The buildings are very important for the modeling because of the building downwash effect. The relationship of the stack height to the building is very important. We also have receptors on the fence line, which is typically done, and we have a receptor grid. As you can see here, we're assuming the background is 88 micrograms per meter cubed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to the Lakes Environmental Software. Hopefully this works. And what I've done is I've actually completed the model run, and I don't know if everyone can see the, here we go. If you can see the very bottom right, the maximum value on the bottom right here, this is combining all impacts, the highest, first high, is 1,132.3. Well, that's way above the 188 standard, right, for NO2? Well, that's a typical result you're going to get in some of these analyses. I wouldn't be too surprised if you get hundreds or even thousands of NO2 micrograms per meter cubed in your first run. I've also done the first refinement because that's just not going to work. I have included the highest 8th high from the form of the standard. And you can see it really helps a lot. It actually brings us down to 636. We're still well above the standard, but we brought the results way down. So the question is, what's causing the problem? What's causing the issue? Well, if you can see here what I've done is I've grouped the boiler and the engine impacts separately. If we look just at the boiler impacts, we'll see that the impact is only about 24 for the high 8th high. If we look at the engine impacts, we'll see that we're at 635. So this analysis really is driven by the engine and not by the boiler. So it's important to set aside the different sources like this and figure out what's causing the impact. Well, this just isn't going to work. If I add 636 to the background, I'm still way above 188. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try some different things. I'm going to go into the modeling conversion of NOx to NO2. And I'm going to turn on PV-MRM. And I've actually done some stack testing. So I'm going to change my 0.2 in-stacked ratio to 0.1. So I'm now going to run PV-MRM. I'm also going to work on the stack, the engine stack, because I know that's a problem. Okay, my release height right now is 12 feet. I'm going to change that to 25 feet, raise that stack up. That's pretty easy to do. And I've figured out a way to phase my emissions during the hour during testing so I can cut my emissions in half. So I'm going to add that refinement in. And because I changed my stack height, of course, I have to rerun my building downwash, which I'm not going to show you that I've done, but now I'm going to run AirMod. It'll take just a second to get going. Okay. Well, I'm actually not going to make you sit through this because it'll take quite a while for it to run. What I'll do is show you the effect of all of the changes. All right, so after all those changes, our impact is now 78. We got all the way down from 1132 down to 78. Plus 88 equals 166, so we do pass. So just to summarize, what we did here was we started with a baseline, the first high, very conservative, and then immediately went to a high 8th high, but didn't make any other refinements. And you can see how much the value dropped with background. Then we pulled out the stops. We not only had the high 8th high, but we used PVMRM. We did stack testing with we found a 0.1 factor lower than 0.2 and justified that to the agency. We raised the stack height of the engine to 25 feet and reduced the engine emissions by half. Some of these things were quick fixes we probably could have thought about and done fairly easily. PVMRM is a more advanced technique, but was fairly easy to turn on and do. But these things did take some thought. So in this case, some advanced refinements were needed to pass. Well, to sum up this presentation, what I'd like to say is that the new NO2, SO2, and PM2.5 ambient standards, they will cause new challenges. And I think you can expect, but you do need to confirm, that complicated full impact modeling may be required if you're doing a permit project, a PSD project, and so forth. What you need to do is conduct modeling due diligence early to troubleshoot the problems, be aware of them, and figure out how to solve them. I do recommend you hire an expert modeling consultant, somebody that has experience with the latest tools like AirMod, and guidance, understands the guidance from the agencies. Also has experience passing the standards using advanced techniques. Bluescape has spent a lot of time in a number of projects with these kinds of projects, and we can help you solve those problems. Hang on one second. My model run just finished and want to take me back to it, so hang on. Okay. And we're back. So hire an expert modeling consultant and also interact with the state agencies. Come with a strategy, work with the agency to figure out the best way to solve the problems you're facing in the project. In some cases, the states might be a little bit more lenient in the interim on some of these significant impact levels. They may or may not have higher or lower standards. It depends on how conservative they are with the modeling. But it's important to talk with them. I think a lot of these agencies are trying to figure out what to do. They're waiting for EPA to provide more guidance. So there will be a lot of inconsistency going into this year or next year until EPA does promulgate more guidance. So it's very important to stay on top of developing EPA and state guidance to find out in your state, your particular project, exactly what to do going forward. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. I'd like to mention we are going to have our next webinar on December 7th at 9 a.m. It's called EPA's GHG Reporting Program in 2011, Are You Ready? And that will include figuring out what you need to do to prepare, key reporting timelines, roles and responsibilities, comparisons and overlaps with state requirements, EPA software preview, reporting needs and gap filling, and alternative method calculation methodologies. And here's my contact information with questions if you have questions. Also to let you know the webinar presentation, many of you may want to see this presentation. It will be posted on SlideShare and Scribd by later today or tomorrow. Please do take a look for that by tomorrow. And what I'll do right now is I'll take a couple questions, I think, as we have time here. The first question is, please comment on NO2 NOx ratios for heaters, boilers, combustions, engines, etc. I have been looking for some of this information. I found a analysis in San Joaquin Valley Air District, which had ratios for different sources. For the boilers, the conclusion was that 0.1 is a good ratio. For diesel engines, actually 0.2 was the ratio. It was a draft study. It was nothing that I think the district had approved, but that was one study that I've seen before. It can vary depending upon the type of source. One thing to keep in mind is that the higher the temperature conditions in the stack, the higher the potential NO2 formation in the stack. So that's why you typically see boilers, low heat heaters, sources have lower NO2 formation. I'm hoping that EPA will come out with some guidance on this as well from some stack testing. If you like, if you want to follow up with me, I can send you the San Joaquin study so you can take a look at that. The next question is, if your client is above the NSR threshold, how do you advise them to offset their emissions? If the client is above the NSR threshold, offsetting emissions is one technique. And I guess what you should keep in mind here is that offsetting emissions or reducing emissions is not always the only technique you can use. Sometimes you do want to go into modeling to avoid more expensive changes. As far as the emissions offsets go, there can be techniques of offsetting emissions within a facility. In other words, putting those emissions into the project or as a separate project. But under the PSD rules, you have to be very careful about how you do that, because if you have a reduction in emissions somewhere at the facility as an offset, you could also trigger netting, which could bring in other projects. So the PSD netting analysis then can be very complicated if you're trying to do that. So sometimes it's easier to go through the modeling process and work on just the project sources than to go forward and include other offsets on the facility. Well, that's all the time we have right now. I'll leave this contact information up here for a few more minutes. I really thank everyone for joining today, and if you do have any questions about your modeling project, please do not hesitate to call me. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.